we've had a U-turn in policy, particularly at the federal level. In March of 2022, Canada released its Green Bond Framework. And it was written partially by Chrystia Freeland, our Deputy Prime Minister, and also by our Minister of Environment and Climate Change, who is a former Greenpeace activist with a long and principled anti-nuclear stance. And it's listed nuclear alongside gambling, tobacco, and firearms. And that was the rationale for its exclusion, of the exclusion of nuclear from Canada's Green Bond Framework. Why a green bond would ever even be considered for funding tobacco, firearms, and gambling is an odd question in of itself, but that's where we stood in March of 2022. Naturally, this was an outrageous position, particularly as we'd started to see the growing consensus that nuclear is green and clean and belongs in these clean energy taxonomies. Europe, it was a little bit of a soap opera, watching things move back and forth, but they were well along the way in that process, and the rationale given was, based upon the prevailing winds of international finance, and we're just not ready for it yet. My organization, Canadians for Nuclear Energy, I think really stepped into taking an important role in pushing back on this. There are 76,000 Canadians, mostly concentrated in my home province of Ontario, who work within the nuclear sector, who do incredible work, who are climate heroes, who delivered one of the only coal phase-outs in the world, which was not a coal to gas phase-out, but a coal to nuclear phase-out. We went from 54 smog days a year in my city to 0. It was the greatest greenhouse gas reduction we've experienced in North America. There's every reason that nuclear is green and that these folks delivered it. Naturally, these 76,000 people, these workers, these climate heroes, were not happy to be lumped in with the sin stocks. And we really capitalized upon that outrage. There's a really interesting mechanism in the Commonwealth system. It's a House of Commons petition. If you gather sufficient signatures, you can have your petition read on the floor of the House of Commons, and it mandates a written response from government. And so that's what we did. We were the fourth most signed petition in the economy and finance section in terms of the various petitions that are available. And it led to a really exciting lobbying campaign in Ottawa. And interestingly, in terms of the sort of political theory of change of starting a grassroots pro-nuclear movement in Canada, when this was beginning, we were looking around, who can be the base for this if we really want it to be powerful, if we really want this movement to make a difference? At first, you start looking around at the environmentalists, and maybe I can convince 1 in 100 environmentalists to see the light on this. But that's not a good energy return on energy invested, and that's really what we care about in energy and in nuclear in particular. What I saw was 76,000 people, again, who understand the benefits of nuclear energy, who are quiet, though, politically. And what we were able to do was motivate that base, and the government of Canada, in this exclusion, in this mistaken policy, had inadvertently really activated that sector. We provided, I think, a good mechanism for them to raise their voice. And ultimately, again, 76,000 people have 76,000 votes, and the industry, of course, extends beyond that. Our Canada refurbishments mean that we have skilled trades unions involved. Not all of the boilermakers of Ontario work in the nuclear sector, but we're talking now about the combined building trades representing 300,000 workers. And again, mobilizing this base was a very important political lever on the political process. We got the great news just several weeks ago that the government has come around, has seen the light, has seen this emerging consensus in the financial world that nuclear is clean and green, and we were very excited to see that nuclear has been included in Canada's Green Bond, joining the country of Korea, joining the European Union, and hopefully many more now. And so, it is my sincere hope that this can further de-risk capital moving into nuclear, provide the low-cost capital that is so necessary to make nuclear affordable, particularly in these inflationary times and in this time of higher interest rates. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. We'll keep focused on Canada for a moment. So one of my favorite quips from this whole event was yesterday EDF UK Simone Rossi saying, "We've gone from PowerPoint to Hinkley Point." No, David, Victor, and I got a lot of questions on how do we finance new nuclear in our session, and how particularly do we finance first of a kind of new technology. And we have someone else in the room who has actually gone, I don't have a good Darlington to PowerPoint rhyme, but anyway, we have Ontario Power Generation in the room who are actually moving forward way beyond PowerPoint into real projects. And so I would love to hear from Nicolle on the financing story of both the Darlington refurbishment, but primarily tell us about how did you get on the, into the ground, let's say, on the new SMR project.
And it's been interesting because we're often talking about how are we going to finance this as if it's an issue that's going to be 5, 10, 15 years away, and we are very much in it today. We have our Darlington refurbishment, which is a $12.8 billion project, and if that was the only one we had, that would have, we could have financed that on balance sheet, not worried about it. The reality is when Canada signed on to the tripling nuclear, the bulk of that is going to happen through OPG. And so we really need to be looking at what tools do we have to actually be able to finance the tripling the nuclear. And that includes our SMR. So we have announced, and I'm happy to say there are dump trucks on site. I feel like a little toddler boy when I go on site now because you see so many dump trucks going up and down the road. So we've started construction on the first SMR. And we announced this summer that we will actually build a fleet of 4. So we'll have 4 on the same site. So the common infrastructure that we're building now will actually accommodate 4 SMRs. We're also looking for large nuclear sites. We have a number of old coal sites that are perfect for repurposing. So we're doing those assessments now to understand better which sites would take what technology. So lots going on. From a financing perspective, I would say there's 5 key tools that we have in place right now that's enabling us to keep going. And the first is that the Government of Canada has come up with ITCs, so investment tax credits, ranging between 15% and 30%, critical for us to have cash flow to be able to continue to move forward with our growth. And they're funded, based on the fact that Canada has added nuclear to their green bond framework. Now they have the ability to actually fund those ITCs. The second piece is a Canadian Infrastructure Bank, again funded by the federal government. They've given us low cost financing for our first SMR. We expect for the first 2, they will provide a significant chunk of the financing. Our expectation is by the time we make it to the 3rd, we've proven cost and schedule to a point where we can actually bring in conventional investors and not need to worry about having someone who's taking that incremental risk financing on their balance sheets. Our other tools that we are using, we have a regulatory construct that allows us to have certainty of return on capital and return of capital, which I think is critical in many markets that are relying on that merchant world, don't have that in place, and that's critical for us. And then we also have our green bond framework that we have just added nuclear to and went out over the summer and raised $300 million of nuclear green bonds, which were highly oversubscribed and really quite successful. And so we see that as a critical tool for us. And then finally, we have clean energy credits and looking at that as a program to supplement the value that we're getting from nuclear.
Thank you, Nicolle. I'm going to bring Eleonore in because she might be offering you even another pathway of financing. But first, I would be flayed alive here and very disappointing the audience if I didn't at least try to ask the question, could you give us an insight on the costs of the BWX300 project? Or if not, some insight on how you will eventually communicate the cost of the project.
Yes. I will tell you that from a nuclear perspective, one of the things historically that we have done wrong is come out with a cost too early and then be held to it in the public's eye. So we have not come out with the cost of the first SMR, and we will not come out until we've completed engineering and truly understand what that cost is. Once we come out with it, we will stand behind it and we will complete it on time and on budget. But I think it behooves all of the nuclear industry to really be very careful when we're throwing numbers out, that they are numbers we can stand behind. So we will not do that until, we expect to have final investment decision next year, late next year, early 2025. That's when we really start the nuclear element of the construction. And at that point, we'll have an understanding of what's the first-of-a-kind cost, but also the fleet of 4. Because I think it's also important to talk about what is it ultimately going to cost for the fleet of 4. The first one, we all know, is going to be more expensive than the rest. So we'll just call a spade there. And that's why it was so important that we announced that we're going to build unit 2, 3, and 4, because the reality is we need to get to that 4th unit to be able to say, this is what we are confident you can go and build a BWRX 300 unit 4. We have to have done it enough times to have worked out the kinks and understand it'll take this long and this much money. And until we get to that point, you're still in the first-of-a-kind cost world. And so that's sort of how we think about costs and why we don't give a number out today.
Thank you. I wasn't expecting you to actually give me an absolute number. That makes sense on communication. Do I take it correctly then that after 4 units, you think most of the, say, replication and proving out benefits have already been taken in, so unit 5 will cost somewhat similar to unit 4?
That's our expectation. There's always, obviously the 5th unit's going to be built on a different site, so there's always site-specific costs. But yeah, we think that once we get to that 4th unit, and we've seen this through our refurbishment. So we have 4 units we're refurbishing right now at Darlington, and the first one cost a lot more and took a lot more time. And we've shaved hundreds and hundreds of days off of the units as we've progressed through, and we're now almost completed our 3rd unit, and we're have taken down the 4th unit, so we have them overlapped. So we understand how that progression happens and how you use your project management tools to actually get your lessons learned and actually be able to drive those efficiencies through construction.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to bring in Eleonore, who is representing a company called Granular Energy, who is a startup, but I would say also a leader in what was mentioned by Google yesterday. I don't know if everyone was here, but Google, Devin Sweezy from Google, explained how Google was sourcing 100% of their annual electricity consumption, I think in 2017 already, by clean energy. They met their annual targets, whereas hourly targets, so matching actual time resolution of their electricity demand with clean energy, they're not even there yet. They're hoping to be there 2030. So the annual matching is easy to achieve, was already achieved many years ago. Hourly matching, not yet. Can you explain what is this idea about, and how does it relate to financing of new clean energy?
Yes, so there's another way of financing or bringing revenues to carbon-free assets, and it's channeling the demand. There's more and more demand for carbon-free procurement. And so there's been a system in place for over 20 years now, that's saying, okay, well, if we have end consumer demand for carbon-free power, there's a little premium there. And we have a certificate, an environmental attribute certificate, EAC, that's the global name, that can kind of reward those assets, saying, right, you've produced a megawatt hour of nuclear or wind or hydro, the customer has paid a premium for that, and they can then claim they've got clean power, they can report that in the GHG protocol, etc. There's a bunch of changes and shifts to that system, right? It's helped a lot build some carbon-free assets, but it needs some improvements, going a little step further to make sure that we really channel the huge demand that there is today. And I think there's 3 big trends right now we're seeing in this space. One is that the price has dramatically shot up, which is good for renewable or carbon-free producers. It's gone from, at least in European markets and in the US, it's gone from less than €1 per megawatt hour to, it's gone to 15, it's gone to 25 pounds in the UK. So there is demand for it. The second trend we're seeing is that nuclear is being more and more included in these certificates. Historically, it covered wind, solar, hydro, and now, The EU has integrated them at the beginning of the year. The UK, I think, in the summer at some point said, okay, nuclear qualifies for these certificates. So nuclear is being involved. And then the third trend is going down towards more granularity. And instead of saying, you know, your certificate just has to cover your consumption at any time, it has to cover it, the generation has to be aligned with the consumption. And that's a massive benefit for the firm, you know, carbon-free generation or for the base load. So for nuclear, it's a huge new revenue opportunity to kind of play on these certificates, use the demand that is there from customers to have, you know, renewables around the clock or carbon-free around the clock powering them. And actually, I've got a question going that way. I know we're aligned, but I'm keen to see and hear, Nicolle, have you seen demand for such certificates? Have you started working on them? Have your customers brought it up to you?
Yes, absolutely. We actually announced last year that we had an agreement with Microsoft. We worked with them for a number of years to try and understand, in our unique, Ontario has a unique market, how we could provide these types of clean energy credits. And so we announced last year that we had a deal with Microsoft, and they had purchased some credits from us, both hydro, and for the first time in North America, we had a nuclear clean energy credit issued for between us and Microsoft. And so it was an incredible moment for us. And really that was our starting point for understanding how do you do that for an SMR, and how do we extract that value of the clean attributes of the SMR, because in our regulated world it won't come out unless we can sort of decouple the energy from that credit and sell that credit. So yes, I'm excited to learn more about the services you're offering and see if we can work together on getting that 24/7 model into Ontario.
Okay, I think it's time we bring banking into the discussion with Sebastien. He's representative of the largest banking group in Europe, and you are based in Paris, France. So I want to ask a similar question to the Canadian question. France is embarking now on a quite ambitious new build program of nuclear. Is BNP involved? Have you made any investments or provided any credit for nuclear projects in Europe or elsewhere, or are you planning to? Can you explain the position of BNP?
Yes, thank you. So we monitor each year the carbon intensity of the power mix that we finance for years. And for historical and geographical regions, this carbon intensity is quite low. So it was in 2020, it was around 200 grams of CO2 per kilowatts, which is rather low. And we have the target to decrease that by 30% between 2020 and 2025. And why it's so low? It's because we finance renewable, but because we finance already, we have already a lot of nuclear in our mix. And for us, it's very important because we have very strong commitment towards energy transition, meaning that we want to develop more and more low carbon energy. So first point, it's a point of wording, but we have been discussing for quite long, for quite a long time, and how should we label nuclear energy, green, sustainable, and these kind of things. The issue is very, very controversial in Europe, so for the time being, we label it low carbon, because low carbon, it's clear, it cannot be discussed. Nuclear is low carbon. And each time we discuss with German guys or French guys or whatever, okay, is nuclear green or not? It can lead to endless discussions that are not very useful. So we label nuclear as low carbon, and this. And so we monitor the financing, our financing to the power sector, to the energy sector. And at the end of last year, our financing to the energy sector was more than 50% for low carbon energy. So more or less, it was an amount of 28 billion euros to low carbon energy, including 3 billion euros of nuclear energy. And we want to increase this amount to reach at least 40 billion euros by 2030. And it will amount to at least 80% of the low carbon energy will account for at least 80% of the whole energy, the whole financing to the energy sector. And so obviously, nuclear will be still a big part of it. And so more widely at the French level, I think that France is at a very interesting step of its energy history, and mostly because of nuclear. Because we are one of the 3 countries with the largest nuclear capacity, with the States and China. And all this was decided in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and it was decided in a very, very different context. So it was decided by a very limited number of people, so the French president and a few civil servants. It was completely financed with the public money. So return on investment at that time to invest on nuclear was not an issue. It was only an issue of security of supply, energy security for France. So return on investment, okay, that was not an issue. And so we built quite a number of nuclear power plants. We stopped during more or less 2 decades, 2 or 3 or 4, 3 to 4 decades. And now we realize that, okay, what next? Because our power plants, they will come to their end of life in 1 or 2 decades. We have to think of the future. And so now we realize that we have to probably prepare new power plants, new nuclear power plants. So the government and President Macron made a few announcements on this. So 6 new nuclear power plants in the coming years. So it's quite ambitious. We have to start over, and we have to start over in a very different context. So politically speaking, in the 60s, it was the decision of a handful of men. Now we have to discuss with everybody, more or less, in France, in Germany, in Europe, and so on and so on. So it's quite a complex process, very interesting, but quite complex. And the financing question is as well completely different. So it's not only public debt. So we have to think of economic viability, of return on investment, but we have to think of this topic with very long-term perspective, because, okay, building a nuclear power plant is a very long-term project, and we have to take into account this long-term aspect in our calculation, in the way we finance it. It's a topic that we encounter quite often when we talk of energy transition, but it's even longer term with nuclear power. And so definitely we have to find new ways of financing these power plants to be able to reach our commitments in terms of energy transition and low carbon energy.
Thank you.
If I can just add an
please.
interesting point. We have toured more bankers through our nuclear facilities in the last 12 months than we have in the 50 years that we operated them before. To your point around really trying to get the banking industry to understand what is the nuclear industry, set eyes on it, understand how we deal with used fuel, how it operates, to really help you come up to speed from a technical perspective, to be able to understand risks and how do you think about investing. So it's been an interesting journey for us as well, trying to help the finance industry get there.
So I have anecdotally been to quite a few meetings trying to discuss financing of new nuclear, where you have all these taxonomies and green bond structures and frameworks that now, very recently, are including nuclear as part of the mix. And what I've heard, and please comment on this if you have a different experience or the same experience, is we have these frameworks and taxonomies, including nuclear, but the banks themselves, the finance institutions themselves, also have an ESG committee and their own frameworks. And typically it passes the international ones, the politically controlled ones that we have done, for instance, the European Union, European Commission. But inside the banks, it's enough for someone to say, we're not comfortable with this still, and it still doesn't pass the internal bank ESG verification. Is that something that you've noticed, and Sebastien, very concretely for your bank, but also Nicolle and whether Eleonore and Qvist has any experience of this. This is what I'm hearing. Is that true, or is it also improving?
From yes, so BNP Paribas perspective, so we have sector policies, so we have investment and financing policies for specific sectors, and we have one, so all in all we have eight such policies, and one on nuclear power, obviously. And so in this policy, we try to define quite clear conditions under which we accept or not to finance the nuclear power plants. So most of our criteria relate to actually safety. So it's about the legal framework of the country, of the host country. It's about the independence of monitoring of the teams in charge of safety verifications. It's about international cooperation, making sure that the host country has good relationship with the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's about the existence and the real implementation of a national security agency, and it's about as well about the technology, because okay, nuclear is quite complex, so there are technologies that are fully implemented in several countries and we can really trust them. There are new technologies, so we rely on a few countries and on a few agencies from these countries to accept or not, because we cannot accept technologies, we are not nuclear engineers, so we rely on a few reference countries in terms of nuclear power to select the technologies that these countries consider as safe enough and yes, trustworthy enough. So it's quite a long process, but for us it's very important to make sure that we finance only projects on which we feel confident that they will be conducted in a safe way with secure management of waste and these kind of things.
And maybe I'll speak to sort of our experience, because we did go out this year for a nuclear green bond. We raised $300 million, and it was almost 6 times oversubscribed. Of the investors, 80% of them had an ESG mandate, and so had gone through the due diligence process that you've just described to understand whether we meet all those criteria. And so we felt quite confident, given that there was a substantial number of people who actually had the ESG mandate and had to do that diligence, and were continuing to invest in our bonds. So we feel like our nuclear green bond program is going to be very successful. It's going to be a key piece of how we continue to raise the money to continue to invest. And we're looking actually at the framework now to see how else do we expand it. And one of the key things we want to do from an expansion perspective, and this is important for Canadians, is we want to move it from green bonds to a sustainable finance program that includes investments from an Indigenous perspective. And so nothing will get built, no nuclear will get built in Canada without alignment with our First Nation communities. And so whether that means they have an equity investment in the project, or whether that means there's another type of agreement, they will be there at the table with us. And so we want to expand our green bond program to say, if we make investments that are really backstopping equity for the Indigenous communities to invest in our project, that should qualify. And that's an important piece for us, and I think really goes a long way to supporting our views and our reconciliation action plan from an Indigenous perspective. So that's sort of what we see. So next year at the farm, we'll be talking about hopefully how we actually have issued bonds with a broader framework.
If I may, on this topic of ESG pressures, in terms of the role of nuclear advocates winning over the public, I think we often imagine that this is just the average citizen. But of course, people in finance are in the public, and the vast majority of green finance is going to renewables. And these financial figures are familiar with those narratives and unfamiliar with those of nuclear. The waste bogeyman the molehill that has become a mountain in public perception, and again, that public includes folks in finance, continues to be a major issue. And I think one of the dangers that we see in the emerging green taxonomies is a kind of ratcheting where, requirements for accident-tolerant fuel, requirements for a DGR in order to qualify, which create further barriers. Not that we don't need to continue to work on these things, but they're potential barriers. And so the reframing and the ability of advocates who are not industry tied to be a little more bold with our communications is really important here. So for instance, when many of the advocates here will talk about waste, we say this is a strength of the technology, not a weakness. And it's very important to compare technologies together. There is no energy producing technology that does not have a waste issue, and none of them are resolved. I mean, climate change is a waste product, CO2, of fossil fuel burning. But similarly, in Canada we have a huge hydroelectric infrastructure. Methyl mercury is a waste product of hydro dams from organic matter decaying and this uncontained heavy metal working its way up through food chains and ultimately into humans. We have a waste problem that is unresolved when it comes to the enormous quantities of solar panels we're producing or wind turbine blades. When you put this in context and you're able to reframe the narrative and talk about waste as a strength and communicate it in such a way, and this is very Canadian, this is a solid form of waste. It is produced in minute quantities. And for the Canadian reference, all of the civilian nuclear waste, the spent fuel that we have produced at our power plants in Canada, can fit on one hockey rink, piled one telephone pole high. So it's these sorts of, I think, the kind of creative messaging that advocates are able to use. It's not just for the general public. The general public includes finance figures and figures who, again, are very familiar with the narratives of renewables and that side of green energy, but not yet familiar with nuclear.
Yeah, and very quickly to add to that point, we see the same in the certificate space where end buyers typically have a preference for wind and solar. They're like, we want wind and solar certificates. And then the supplier turns around and often says, well, in that case, we won't be able to provide you the hourly matching you're looking for. We can't give you that full coverage. And then there's a bit of an explanation about the sun doesn't shine at night. There's an educational piece, and I think, as you're saying, yes, the taxonomy has changed, but it does take some time to filter down, to renew contracts, to change that up. So I think, we're seeing and buyers starting to ask for it once they've understood, okay, well, actually, this is a valuable certificate to me, and that's when we're going to see that, that demand signal sent back to the asset.
Excellent. Yeah.
I would like to go back to Chris' point. So I fully agree. Bankers and finance people are not very knowledgeable about nuclear. So anecdotally speaking, our CEO is a nuclear engineer by background, but he may be the only one in the World Bank. So obviously, I don't know if it's education or dialogue, because as bankers, we are quite risk adverse, and what is new creates new risk, but we have to educate people internally to make sure that they understand the risk and the opportunities. And it can go through yes, a constructive dialogue with all the actors in the nuclear field to make sure that we as bankers, as financiers, fully understand the risk and opportunities, and so that we can finance what we find really relevant in the end. And it takes time, but I think this dialogue is really worth it.
I think we're noticing this, and maybe it's my own ignorance, but in meetings like COP, every meeting like COP, there's an announcement of a new, huge clean energy fund. It was, Altera was announced the other day, $30 billion. And I am personally not ever able to see if nuclear qualifies or not so far in all of these funds. But maybe this is a transition we are just starting. Maybe this is the kickoff where that discussion will need to be had next time you're announcing a fund. Someone in the audience will ask, will nuclear qualify, and if not, why? How far along are we, would you say, in this journey on the what used to be called renewable energy certificates? Are they now more renewable energy certificates, or are they now more clean energy? The trajectory is clear, but where are we on that path?
Yeah, I think it does vary by country. Some countries group them all together and say, okay, nuclear is involved in these certificates, it's fine. In some countries, they are still separate types of certificates. But we're definitely seeing more countries go towards integrating them into the same bucket as wind, hydro, solar. So I think that's one of the policy points that still needs a bit of progress, I think. Actually, there's 2 points that still need progress to make this more natural and work up. One is, integrating nuclear, making sure it's got the same, not value, because it will have potentially different values depending on the timings of the other resources, but making it equal to a renewable energy certificate in terms of how it can contribute to your GHG accounting and to carbon-free supply. And then secondly, it's shifting towards this hourly certificate. That's still a piece which, is starting to come. It's on the horizon. There's a few use cases in which it's going to be essential, hydrogen being one of them. To be able to produce green hydrogen, there'll have to be clean power every single hour going into the electrolyzer. So we're starting to see this come into place, but there's still some work to be done on a policy level to make sure that this hourly certificate is the norm, and it will really help drive value, drive investment back into the assets.
Okay, and in terms of, Chris, you are maybe one of the world's leading educators, public educators, and presenters on nuclear energy. You're raising public understanding. You said finance people like Sebastien obviously are members of the public, but are you finding this audience? Are they listening to you? Are they coming on your podcasts? Or are they kind of living in their own bubble and not really receiving the message? How much are they receiving these messages?
I think there's a very interesting phenomenon from polling about any controversial topic, but that would include nuclear. If you are asked about a controversial topic and you have no idea what anyone around you is thinking, you're going to be conservative in terms of how you respond to that. Once you start to see figures coming out, and again, this is why I'm referring to ourselves as living in the age of the influencer. Once you see people that are making bold arguments, unashamed arguments, unconventional arguments, creative arguments, then you've been curious maybe, or you have been pro-nuclear, but you just didn't want to mention it because you assumed other people were going to judge you. This is, I think, what's important. In terms of finance on the podcast, this is an area that I must move into and explore a little bit more. But again, I can't stress it enough. Doctors, we're just members of the public. Finance figures, they're also members of this broader public. The politicians who are crafting these taxonomies and making them more difficult for nuclear to qualify or more easy, they're members of the public. And so, I think there's just a really untapped role here. It's emerging, this phenomenon again of communicators like myself. But we saw this great group of youth up here today. And you may think, the comms battle has been won. We've gained social license. We've got 22 countries signed up for the pledge, but there is always more work to do. There is so much inertia in the system in terms of the mythology around nuclear. And we've got to bust those myths, and I think we've got to keep working.
And Nicolle, when you have successfully issued green bonds for nuclear, you had 6 times oversubscription. Was that just Canadian institutions really trusting OPG? You're saying this is a creditworthy institution. They can finish their refurb programs on time or before time, even ahead of schedule, on budget. We don't really care it's nuclear. We trust OPG. We want to finance OPG, or was it more like the whole, the world of finance came into Canada, looked at a nuclear project, assessed it as a nuclear project, and said, we're going to go for it?
Yeah, it was much broader than just the Canadian market. And just on, I think Chris is absolutely right on. It feels to me, while we've talked about, great job issuing the nuclear green bonds, we've got clean energy credits, we've got influence from the Canadian government, it feels like we've just cracked the door open. And so it doesn't feel like we're on a level footing yet with the other renewables, and it feels like if we don't keep pushing and pushing and pushing that door, it's going to swing back and whack us in the head. And so I do feel like we need to keep moving and pushing the next thing and the next thing to to be able to get to that common footing with renewables. When I look at our clean energy credits is probably the most apparent example. When we sold to Microsoft some hydro credits and some nuclear credits, and the nuclear credits were significantly less value than the hydro credits. And so that's the indication to me that they'd still rather have the renewables. They're willing to take the nuclear, and we need to get that really so that we are on par with one another, and that they don't see nuclear as sort of, well, it's a cheaper alternative. It really is an equal, as good alternative.
So the nuclear industry is quite unique, particularly the utilities that run nuclear plants, in that it's not very competitive in the sense that we know that if someone has a problem, everyone has a problem, so everyone collaborates and works together as much as possible. Is there an idea to expand on your green bond success with other parties? We have new build programs in other countries. Can you join up to make an international version of this that pools more into a big, let's say, nuclear financing fund or something like that? Is there any discussions around internationally around this?
I don't know whether there is or not. I
Should
know
there be?
we are not the only ones. Like Bruce Power, who's also a nuclear operator in Ontario, has also successfully issued green bonds, so it wasn't a fluke. We're quite confident that the market is out there. Whether we look at other structures in how we sort of come together, I think the way we've established the framework and the way we validate our nuclear as green, I think, is a great model for other utilities to look at and emulate, certainly in the international market.
Thank you very much. We have reached the last minute or so of our session. I hope it's been interesting. I hope we didn't miss anything. I would like to pass it over to Chris because he's, I don't know, one of the most inspirational speakers I think we have for final words. Sorry for putting this in your lap, Chris.
No,
but can you do my job and wrap this up for me? Summarize it for me?
Sure, I'll try and be very brief. I think something that's very, very important for the industry and something that we have been encouraging the industry in Canada is not to box ourselves into what currently has social license. And so there's been such a focus on SMRs and sort of attempt to rebrand and move away from some of the issues that we faced in the past, that's worked its way in and has become a little bit of a self-defeating mechanism. So for instance, when Canada first started discussing its clean energy tax credits, in terms of nuclear, it only included small modular reactors. We saw in the state of Illinois, when they lifted the nuclear ban, there's been a back and forth, the government vetoed it, and finally they've settled on, okay, we're going to allow new nuclear, but only nuclear under 300 megawatts. Why are we constraining ourselves? Why are we holding ourselves back? We need to include it all. We had another successful petition campaign, which was to include, alongside SMRs, large nuclear, and refurbishments and uprates, and the government agreed, and the final iteration of the clean tech investment tax credits in Canada include all nuclear. So let's not be self-defeating, let's be bold, and let's win this.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our panel very much.